Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Today we're going to talk about reproductive care, abortion, and all of obviously very complex issues that surround that very sensitive and very important topic. Our guest today is Tatiana Perkins. She is the manager of patient advocacy programs for Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And other than the very sort of long career that she has had as a young person working on this issue, currently her main role is to help patients and folks tell their stories about the impact that Planned Parenthood has had. So I think for us here at MurMur, it's really sort of apropos that we're leading off with her, because that's kind of what we believe, is that folks need to tell their stories, and stories is what makes an impact. And she has an incredible story, personal story, that you guys will hear about what got her into this work.
What an impressive young woman. She's in her mid-20s. She has knowledge and poise and passion, and it has just given me so much hope and excitement. Hope that we are going to be able to rectify the situation that we're in terms of much diminished access to abortion and other reproductive care. I also feel like for me, her job of helping patients become advocates was my story of going to Planned Parenthood as a 17-year-old, and then going to college and having a Planned Parenthood, and we're talking about, I hate to say this, 1977, where abortion, the Roe versus Wade was still relatively new. Volunteering to help patients enter a Planned Parenthood clinic that was being picketed, and then really beginning to understand, the whole legal and political situation, which you thought would be good. We just had Roe versus Wade, but the pushback was starting, and I ended up testifying in the state legislature about access to birth control for young people. And it just really kind of brought me back to that time. And I think for me, it really connected. I ended up I feel like I emotionally processed the Dobbs decision in a way that I hadn't yet. And I don't know if my experience is 40 some years old, but it seems really relevant to some of the issues today. But abortion was legal then. And so just really underscored how much this issue matters. And I do hope that we get back to abortion being safe, legal, and available by the time this matters to my granddaughter.
I don't want to spoil too much. We'll get into the conversation right away. But the other really interesting part she talked about was cybersecurity, and for organizations that use advocacy, patient advocacy voices, no matter what the issue is, how important it is that you're protecting their digital footprint, that you're protecting them from the real violence and danger that is real, that's out there from some of these extremists, some of these lunatics who are becoming pretty mainstream now, unfortunately, the dangers that it poses to, in this case, the young women or just the women in general who are telling their stories. But no matter what your organization works on, if you're telling if you're using stories, how you can protect folks, she gave some great advice. And then obviously we're seeing what happened in Nebraska, where they're using the digital footprint of a 17-year-old teenager to throw her in jail for 90 days, things that are coming out of Mississippi and Tennessee. So we're seeing the real dangers that this new digital world imposes on these fascist regimes, frankly, that exist in these conservative states, who want to punish women for having legal abortions, who want to punish the families that support them, and who want to punish families for doing things like, gender affirming care, right? Things that are just like, why are we criminalizing these people? They want to do it despite what they say they don't want to do. They clearly want to do it because they're doing it. And so we talk about that too. So it's a complex intersectional issue, if you will. But I think a good conversation. So let's start it. Let's hear from Tatiana. Tatiana, thanks for joining us. Let's just start with, who are you? Give us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? What's the organization you work for? Introduce yourself to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, y'all. My name's Tatiana Perkins. I use she and her pronouns. I am the Patient Advocacy Programs Manager at Planned Parenthood Federation of America and the Action Fund. I've been in this role for, I think, 4.5 years now, which is like a long time, but I've been doing repro work with Planned Parenthood and outside of Planned Parenthood for the past decade or so. And I'm only 27, so it's quite literally a third of my life that I have been in the repro movement. So it's been quite a time just seeing how the landscape has changed. I graduated at college in 2018 at the University of Washington, where I got my bachelor's in law, societies, and justice and political science, and I'm currently getting my master's of social work at Howard University, which is really exciting, balancing full-time work on part-time grad school. It's quite an adventure. I used to work on campaigns, so I've worked in a political campaign doing finance, which was interesting, and ended up doing this whole work of patient-centered organizing and storytelling by way of being a patient at Planned Parenthood, by sharing my own story over a slew of different mediums throughout my adolescence and into young adulthood. And now I'm on this other side where I'm able to get other folks to share their story for advocacy, and I really love the work that I do. Outside of work, I'm a video gamer, so you'll see these little like video game things behind me. I used to stream on Twitch, but then I got too busy, so then I stopped. And I do pole dancing for fun on the side. I just did a competition not too long ago. And I paint in my free time, so that's a little bit about me.
When you say you are the manager of patient advocacy programs, if you could just say a little bit more about what that means and what you're doing.
Yeah, so our patient advocacy program is one of our organizing programs at the national office, and it really centers on getting our patients, people who are going to the health centers, engaged, but also a lot of community outreach for folks who live around health centers. And the whole like theory behind our organizing program is that those who are impacted should be closest to the solution. So we want to make sure that we are, one, reaching out to our communities to get them the resources that they need, and then also inviting them to really be the leaders of the advocacy work that we're doing. So we have a few different programs. One is our health center advocacy program. So it's working with affiliates to get some resources and materials, education in their health centers, and then inviting them to share their story or attend volunteer events, or letting them know on upcoming like things that are happening in their communities or in legislative session. We also have our Healthy Neighborhood Canvassing program, which is canvassing, but it's kind of a blind knock approach so that we're reaching everyone in a community rather than targeted lists, because our idea is that everyone should have access to healthcare regardless of who they vote for or what their background is. Everyone deserves resources, so it's really getting people different, again, information, resources, letting them know of like local laws that have changed, where they can go and access care, how they can get information, just by going door to door and quite literally meeting people where they are. So that's been running for, years and years now. We change it depending on what is happening in the world. We did like a very large COVID-19 vaccine campaign around it, and now we're kind of looking more into what does abortion access look like. So how do we run canvases to get people that information? We also have this entire like huge storytelling program, which is uplifting our patient advocates and getting them to share their stories. Yes, on the national level for national media and at rallies and for the White House and wherever we can get them to share, but also locally, what does it look like sharing within their communities and having patient advocates hold their own house parties and talk to the loved ones in their life, because that's how you change hearts and minds. So there's a large scale and a smaller scale there, and we've gotten a lot of participation in the past few years. It's absolutely increased since SB 8 went in effect, and even more so when Roe fell with the Dobbs decision. And then we started an abortion care basket program as well. So that was when Roe fell, we had to assess really what do communities need in this moment right now. And really there's a big question of, well, how are people actually getting their care? What is their experience going to look like? They're going to have to travel if people are going to go get care, or they're self-managing. Regardless of what it is, we wanted to work with providers at our health centers and put together these baskets that were quite literally just care items and show people that we support them. So things like fuzzy socks and things like coloring books and just like little tea and candles, things that people can use to just kind of, process and like feel good. And then, some folks will have their volunteers write like encouraging notes to folks. And we also give folks like an advocacy opportunity, so that if people are like, wow, I'm really compelled to get involved, we have little QR codes that they can scan and they can get connected to their local organizers to get involved in the work. And that was like a really big community care project that we did. And I think we just distributed around 350,000 baskets to the health centers. Not all of them have been distributed, but they're all being made and they're all happening right now, which is really, really cool. So that was like the most recent project. But yeah, we're kind of like a large program.
Yeah, I was going to ask, can you give me like a little bit of just like the lay of the land as far as like how wide your program? I know obviously Planned Parenthood is a national organization. How far wide? What part of the country do you cover?
So we cover kind of everywhere. I think all, I had to give you a number, I would say I think 44 states run some kind of patient advocacy programs, whether it's the canvassing or the health center or the storytelling. So it's quite literally nationwide. I've talked to people all over the country as far as the storytelling work goes, because we've been able to institute like what it looks like to develop leaders by ways of storytelling. Whenever we have these like large scale events come up, I can kind of just email the organizers in whatever state we're trying to reach, and they'll usually have someone to connect to. So it's really just a testament to the power of like how involved people are in wanting to get and starting to speak out and really like take back what has been lost.
And I just would like to quickly add that I think I'm a great example of a patient turned advocate. I used Planned Parenthood services. I think it would have been 1975 and 76. And when I went to college in St. Paul, Minnesota, there was a clinic about 2-3 miles from the campus that there were bomb threats at. And so the reaction, the pushback was pretty quick. And I fairly regularly, with my friends, would go and escort women into the clinic because there was a lot of harassment. And I eventually ended up testifying in the St. Paul legislature around efforts to restrict minors' access to birth control. So in a pretty short period, I went from patient to advocate. Just to let you know, it really works. I'm sure you know.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's so wonderful. And that's like the story of so many folks that were working, and that's like my story
Right.
too. It's the same thing.
Tell us
It's
your
like
story.
I want to go in. Yeah, oh, absolutely. Um, so I was a patient at Planned Parenthood back in maybe like my sophomore year of high school. Um, and like the reason I was a patient was because I was, in a really bad relationship, and this person that I was with was very abusive. He was, constantly cheating on me, which is like one thing, but also just physically abusive, sexually abusive, very manipulative, and the relationship was short because I was able to kind of suss out that this wasn't a good thing. But there was one situation where he'd like pulled off a condom, and like I was at risk of being pregnant, and I was like, oh my god, I'm 16 and I hate this man. So I told him like literally go to Planned Parenthood or I'm going to scream, and made him drive over to Planned Parenthood to get a plan B and then I took it, and like that was me, and that was my story for there. So I knew that Planned Parenthood was like a safe and good resource, because like it was no questions asked. It was like, here you go, this is what you need, so you're going to have it. Amazing. And I wasn't pregnant with this really abusive dude's child, which is a godsend. But really, like, what calls me into this work and why I do what I do every day is when I was 8 years old, I was raped multiple times over a summer. It was a period that, I don't like to think about, but is very defining for who I am. And I really spent a decade of my life just in shambles, like in depression, as a young child, not really having folks in my family to talk to because they were all hush hush about it. I remember in 5th grade we started getting like our sex ed lessons, and it was just a video of like the guy who lures the child into the van and had like the little signs of like, well, what is sexual assault? And remember sitting there, and it was like, whoa, that's what I did. That's like what I experienced. And I talked to my teacher, who then brought me to one of the vice principals, and I was like, I need to talk about this, but like, please do not tell my parents. Of course they did, so they called my mom in. My mom came in, and she was just like, why didn't you tell me? And she was so angry. And then she was like, well, don't talk about it. And that was really hard. So the rest of my high school or middle school, I just was hush hush about it. And it wasn't until the end of high school that I was approached by somebody who was a friend, and she was on Planned Parenthood's teen council program, and that's a peer-led sex education program, and this was Snohomish County in Washington State. And she was like, we're looking for our next cohort of sex educators. Like, I think you'd be really great for it. And I remembered, Planned Parenthood being a really good resource for me, and I really wanted to be a part of this. So I applied, I became a peer educator, and through that program, I learned about consent and was able to teach consent. And that was the first time that I was actually given the language that I needed to describe what had happened to me, and then also feel like I could start healing from it. And that is why I do the work that I do, because I could be a person that could heal myself, and then also just be in conversation with other folks who've gone through the same thing. I was able to like take my power back. There had been multiple people, even in that year, that because I started being vocal about what happened to me, had taken me aside and said, the same thing happened to me, and I had no one to talk to about it. And that happened so many times that I knew that this, like, speaking out and being vocal and taking power and finding community from folks who suffered through the same thing was such an important thing to do. So I was a sex educator, and then from then on, I continued doing it because I just really knew that people needed resources, they needed friendly faces, and in my community, there weren't that many people that were doing this. So in college, I became the Planned Parenthood Generation Action president, doing campus organizing. In 2017, I did an internship at the national office doing their organizing, and that was the defund summer. So this is when like Planned Parenthood was going to be defunded. And then now doing this storytelling work with my job, it really feels like full circle, like from being someone who was so deeply harmed to then being able to, even to this day, have people tell me, I am so grateful for you sharing your story, like it's really helped me. I feel like this is like the thing that I am called to do, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah, that's obviously an incredible story, and you're a very brave person for putting it all out there first off, and then obviously doing what you did with that. Can you tell us sort of on top of that? I think that like the conversation around this issue becomes a little like sort of black and white, in that it's like Planned Parenthood does abortions, and I think abortions are bad. Planned Parenthood's bad. Can you give us a sense of like all the things that Planned Parenthood does that you've experienced that show why defunding it or closing, the loss of a community that a community can face by obviously what we're seeing now across these sort of conservative states with laws being passed, the threats to Planned Parenthoods and clinics like Planned Parenthoods that do so much for so many people, including reproductive care, which is important, right? But in addition to that, just tell me, because from your experience, like, how have you seen lives change through their interactions with Planned Parenthood other than the story you just told us, which was a great one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because I work with so many storytellers, like there's so many people that have gone to Planned Parenthood for so many different reasons. And right now, abortion is kind of like the hot ticket item because it's the thing that's most under attack. But we know that other repro issues are going to be under attack too. Like there's the anticipation of birth control even, and it's really frightening. But we've done a slew of different like advocacy fights and engaged with people on different issues. And I've talked to folks about a whole ton of issues. So like people have gone to Planned Parenthood for cancer screenings and like couldn't get in at their normal provider or couldn't afford it, and like Planned Parenthood was the place to detect that they had cancer, and like it was quite literally life-saving for them. Or I know there's like folks who have gone to Planned Parenthood because they couldn't afford other places and had been able to just like detect some like issues in the repro system that like wouldn't have gone noticed otherwise. I know for young people, like access to birth control is so important. And I mean, for people like me too, that would never go and tell my mother about this, could go to a Planned Parenthood to then get what they needed for care. And it's just like, there's, with all of the services that are offered, people are benefiting from it, like low income people, queer folks, trans folks with the gender affirming care that exists, which in a lot of places is like Planned Parenthood's the only place they can access it. And we have a lot of like trans storytellers too who are now speaking out about it with the attacks against trans folks, and I think that's super important as well. Even things like STI testing and care. I mean, for me, I've gone to Planned Parenthood for STI testing, and it's so like no nonsense. You just go in, like they're like, hey, have you had unprotected sex? You say yes or no, and like they're just very accepting. Whereas like I've gone to other doctors' offices and I felt a little judged by whatever I was saying, and it's just so important to have providers that actually see you as a person and aren't judging you in any way. And I mean, that's what people would miss out on if Planned Parenthood, if other local indie health centers providing reproductive health care are defunded or aren't offering services or can't offer services anymore and close down. Like that's what they're missing out on, and it's destructive and it's really depressing. Really.
I want to just reaffirm the importance of the very accepting and not being judged. And that was true 50 years ago with Planned Parenthood as it is today.
Can we talk a little bit about, and I'm curious, this is sort of like a two-part question. One's personal and one's professional. Dobbs, right? And the overturning of Roe v. Wade, like obviously that kind of, if I'm doing my timeline correct in your role with Planned Parenthood, happened kind of in the middle, right? Like you like start and then you were like, oh man, this is now a whole different world we're living in. So just from a personal perspective, as a young person who went through a good portion of their high school and college life with this right and now does not have this nationally federally protected right. I'm just curious personally, like when it happened, what your reaction was, what you were thinking, how you felt. I'm just curious to hear that story.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, little anecdote. Back in 2019, we did a presidential candidate forum where we had 22 abortion storytellers come out to South Carolina and share their story and ask a question to all of the Democratic candidates for president that year. And it was such a huge event. We had like 3 weeks to pull it off, and we got everyone there and trained, and it was really successful. And this happened 1 month after I started my job. So I was quite literally thrown into
Welcome.
this, and they're have fun. But it was awesome, and I was just feeling so empowered by this because we'd been able to amplify the voices of so many people and like really get abortion on the national stage, which had been neglected for so many years. And I called my mom afterwards, and I had to ask just out of nowhere, Mom, have you ever had an abortion? And she paused, and then she said, yes, I have, very quietly. And I was standing there, like, I've been doing this work with Planned Parenthood for years now, and she's never once thought to tell me this. And in that moment, it just made me think about how deep abortion stigma is, in that, like, my own mother wouldn't tell me about an abortion she's had when, like, I'm her child, and I had been for 23 years at that point. And it's interesting because she's opened up more since then, and it's probably because I'm just even more and more vocal about things. But when Dobbs happened, I'm like thinking about where I was that day. First, the leak happened in May, so we knew things were going to happen, and we knew it was going to be the worst case scenario. Of course, people were holding on to hope that maybe because the leak happened, they're going to rethink it. I don't have that much faith in institutions.
If you're relying on
so
John Roberts to do the right thing, you're going to be disappointed.
Right.
we'll just say that.
Not going to happen. So I was all prepped and ready. We were kind of we were very closely monitoring the Supreme Court schedule, like when they were releasing decisions, and it was the last day of decisions that they were going to release in that period. So we knew it was going to happen. So I remember getting ready that morning, putting on all of my rally gear, my hat, my fanny pack, just knowing that I'm going to have to be on the steps of the Supreme Court later that day. And it was sad. You know, it was sad getting ready that morning, knowing that I was going to be walking into what was like quite a decimation of our rights that many, many women and people before me had fought for. And I walked into the office. There was maybe me and one other person there at that point. The decision came out, and I cried. I cried for a good solid minute, and then it was time to go, and it was time to work. You know, I thought about my mom and how she had access to abortion and didn't even have to talk about it if she didn't want to. And I think that's really nice that she was able to do that. And then I thought about how many people would not be able to do the same thing anymore, because we knew pretty immediately that states would start rolling back abortion rights and adding bans and restrictions. I thought about my storytellers. I thought about all of the people I've worked with who've had abortions and have been very vocal, have been very deeply involved in this advocacy work, and how it seemed like things kind of all fell through in that moment. And I really, like, I'm not concerned about myself. I feel very privileged in that I right now live in Washington, D.C., so things are okay. But I also know a national abortion ban is looming, and that it could be at risk for all of us. And I mean, I think I fight because I know that I am privileged in that I am okay right now, but I do know that abortion is so important for everyone, has been largely inaccessible for a lot of people who, you know, live in rural areas or face medical discrimination. And it's like go time now more than ever to make sure that rights aren't taken away, like even more so, and that federal protections are actually instituted so that people feel safe and can make decisions about if they want to start a family or if they don't.
What do you want to see happen, or what should we be advocating for folks out there who maybe don't follow as closely as you do but care about this issue? What should we be writing our congressmen and senators for?
Yeah, well, I mean, there needs to be federal protections, like absolutely, because we're seeing that states are just not they're not protecting it right now. They're dismantling it each and every day. I think about states that are deeply red, so the Tennessees and the Texases and I mean the Floridas now, and just like how deep cut all of these issues is, because it's not just abortion, you know. Like you'd said too, like gosh, you in Florida with their new slavery curriculum, like it's so bad, and this is all happening on local levels. Like this is state politics happening. So I think like one important thing to note is that yes, it's so important to vote in elections that are for your senators and for president, but it's also important to vote in elections that are for local races. And it's really important for people to be in community, to see what their state representatives, their state legislators are voting on, and to be up to date and to show up at their state capitals and to actually like go and talk about like what they need and what they want. Connecting with local organizations that are doing the local work too, to attend lobby days and really just like show up as constituents to let them know that you are the power. The one thing that I always like to say is the elected officials, like they work for me. Like I'm the one that they're working for, and their job is contingent on whether or not I want them in the office that they're in. So that's just important for everyone to know, is like that is the case. So I mean, like people can write LTEs, letters to the editor, because their local officials will read those. In local publications too, if they're writing op-eds to them, they'll take a look at those as well. And to show up at lobbying meetings, like that's really a good way to target them. But also like getting involved in local organizing efforts. I know so many states have just been inundated with like really, really bad gerrymandering and what just voting rights being taken away. So even thinking about like what are other issues that are happening in the state, and how can we like really just take democracy back, because that seems to be what the issue is at this point. I also really encourage people, like normal people who care about things, to see if they can run for office, because we're the best representatives for ourselves. And if someone is in a position to where they can run, like there are so many districts where just really bad anti-abortion candidates are running unopposed. So, at least getting a name on a ballot is super important as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like it's interesting that you talked about like the broader picture, right? That there's such an overlap between like anti-LGBTQ laws, anti-trans laws, anti-abortion laws. Like there's and in the Dobbs ruling itself was attack on privacy, right? And that obviously attacks all of these things that we're taking for granted now, like gay marriage, right? Like interracial marriage, all these things. There's just such an overlap among all of these laws and movements. And so it's not a coincidence that Tennessee is really bad on abortion, really bad on LGBTQ rights, and really bad on trans rights, right? Like that's not a coincidence. Like that's strategic. So I do think the overlap is interesting, and how you do that without losing sight of either all of these issues, right? I think is maybe the challenge that we face, but that's for another podcast. I'm curious, like from your perspective on how is this made? How is post Dobbs? I mean, I think we know about a lot of the laws and stuff that are being passed, but I'm curious, like on a ground level, like what have you seen? How was your job? How has work gotten more difficult? Like, what are the things, I know we know about the 6-week bans and stuff, but what is that meaning, on the ground for people, for your storytellers, or just for your organization in general? What's become more difficult other than the obvious?
Yeah, there's been instances where I've talked to organizers in states about putting together a canvas just to like get people information about what's happening in their state, and they're finding that people feel unsafe going door to door. They think they're going to be met with vitriol, or that things are going to escalate because people who are anti-abortion rights will be like physically aggressive with them, and that is something that is like so important to consider, but also impacts the way that we can organize. Safety is the number one important thing when it comes to things like canvassing, and the fact that the landscape is so charged really just shows like how divided people are, and also just like how emboldened people feel in this moment, and that is really, really hard. I also think another thing that people are facing too is just because so many different rights are under attack right now, that like people are fatigued. It's like, okay, this thing, and now this thing, and now this thing, and I can't pay rent. Like all these things are happening at once, and it's really, really difficult. So it's a matter of thinking about how can we, as folks doing organizing for abortion and for repro generally, kind of marry this and the other issues that we're working on via coalition building so that we're really like tapping into all of the things that our communities need to be happy and healthy. You know, like what does it look like when we're talking to a volunteer who really wants to get involved but they can't afford childcare? You know, how can organizations leverage their money and resources to then be able to get folks who are most impacted to get involved? So really rethinking like what does accessibility look like, is something that I think is really important too. The attacks online, I think this has been a thing that has really come, it's really been exacerbated through COVID when everything was online. But it's always existed to where if people are being vocal on the internet, they're at risk of being targeted and harassed. So wanting to make sure that our people know how to stay safe online, prevent being doxxed, really, you know, understand the risks of sharing. There was one thing I did, was when SB 8 went into effect in Texas, their 6-week ban. I went down to a health center in Houston and I was collecting stories for an amicus brief. And that brief was to be used to file against the state of Texas and featured folks' stories who had walked in and were told that they wouldn't be able to get an abortion. And there was someone who I had met and she really was passionate and wanted to speak out and get involved. So we worked with ABC Nightline to get a like documentary type film of her traveling to Mississippi to get an abortion. And I remember sitting down with her and telling her like, you know, it's really like bold and amazing that you're doing this, but number one concern of mine is that you are safe. So I sat with her and we went through her accounts and made sure her whole friends list was curated and that she felt safe with anyone who might have contact with her. I had her private all of her socials, change her profile picture to not show her face, take her last name off everything, make sure that her accounts were really locked. I had her change all of her passwords, really just doing the utmost like cleaning that she could of her social media, and told her that she was going to have to keep it like that until, you know, the news had gone down, just because she was in Texas and, you know, there's folks that would want to, you know, use information and would post negative things too. So wanting to ensure that people know how to stay safe online is like super super important. That, and when folks are sharing, like there's just so like, you know, the people on Twitter that don't have a profile picture, they don't have a username, they don't have a name, their bio is nothing, or it's like Jesus is king and nothing else. They're like the boldest people. They'll go and just say absolute garbage and feel like they have no repercussions because you can't trace them back to anything. And those people make the most vile comments on things. So like, organizations, if they're going to share people's stories on public platforms, they have to filter those comments and they have to delete them because those people are inciting violence. They are not there to have their minds changed. They are there to be terrible, and that is their whole purpose. So making sure that my people are, number one, not reading comments, and that those comments are getting deleted.
Yeah, I assume most of those people are just Russian bots that are trolling, even if they're not. But it just makes it easier to ban them. You're like, all right, you got to put your name on things if you're gonna speak online, right? So I think that's a good policy to share with all organizations. Like if you're talking about sensitive stuff, that's gonna, and I mean even on our accounts, and we're not even that big, and we get the crazy people. And yeah, if it's a user 189999777, just get rid of it, ban it. It's okay. I manage social media accounts. People say don't delete comments. Delete comments. Delete them. If it's like that, you can delete them. Facebook's got the hide button, so they don't know it got deleted. That's the best button ever. It just hides it. No one else sees it. Yeah, I co-sign that.
So, you know, it's so interesting because you did talk in the panel about cybersecurity. And honestly, I did not realize that your comment was about keeping people who were outspoken about it or somehow involved in it safe. I actually thought you were talking about efforts for law enforcement to use um, cyber, your people's searches, digital footprint to go after them. I wanted to know if you had any comments about that.
Well, and even before, just like the context of like what's going on in Nebraska with that 16-year-old that was arrested and sentenced to 90 days in jail, and I think the mother is still waiting her sentencing, but she faced up to 4 years. And the key evidence was Facebook messages they sent between each other, right? And then you see, Mississippi state attorney generals going after health records of people that get abortions out of state, and I think it was in Tennessee they. 100 transgender patients' medical records were turned over to the attorney general. I mean, it's just like it's getting a little crazy out there, and this is the kind of stuff that they don't want the spotlight on, right? So like this is the stuff that when people aren't paying attention, all of a sudden, you know, apps that get tracked. I mean, it's crazy, right? And who knows with Twitter now and whatever X. I mean, it's a wild world out there, and I think we have to be really, really cautious because all of those companies are susceptible to government subpoenas and laws, and if no one's watching, they'll get away with stuff. So sorry, that was just the context for the question. But I'm curious to hear, if what you guys are thinking about that, if that's, I mean, it's a new issue, but if there's thoughts or things you guys are doing, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like absolutely vile how they've been treating this Nebraska, I mean, quite literally teenager about what's been happening. And I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but what we have done is wanting to like get as much information as we can to our volunteers and really anyone in our networks of like how to be safe online. So we've partnered with cybersecurity organizations in the past to help us come up with resources and things to keep people safe online as far as like their own personal digital security. And there are organizations who are really working to address that issue of legality and like what it looks like to be someone seeking services, seeking self-medication, abortion, those things, and be able to do that without having to fear things like what this Nebraska person went through. I think a really great organization for this is If One How. They have a repro legal helpline, and they're able to call in, like someone who may be seeking an abortion is able to call and like actually have the like legalities walked through and what someone's options are. So there are organizations that are thinking about this because this is like such a pressing issue in what's happening and how people are being criminalized for their health care. And it's as an organizer, like what I want and seek to do is get that information to people. I mean, even in terms of communications, I really like lead into using what is it called?
Encrypted,
Why can't I think? Yeah,
yeah, like
that's
WhatsApp,
it. Yeah,
right?
encrypted messaging. Yeah,
Telegram, like
yeah.
these more encrypted, yeah.
Yeah, but just making sure that there's the two-way encryption for messages. That's like one thing that we always recommend that we have volunteers use when they're talking to each other, or if they're at rallies or protests, and if they're talking about things that they could be criminalized for, that could be a good option for them. And we always want to make sure that people have these options and these resources for when they're looking things up.
And I mean, the laws that are being passed in states are important, right? So like the Biden administration is changing HIPAA laws that explicitly deny states' abilities to get the access of abortion records of women who have traveled to states where it's legal, right? So that's an important thing. The states are pushing back on that, so following that, right, and ensuring that law enforcement agencies, or more specifically the hospitals, right? So the thing in Tennessee was Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt University just turned over the medical records without even asking a question, right? And so there's now a lawsuit against them and things like that, like put pressure on these medical universities or medical facilities, put pressure on these folks to say, no, 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 like if you do these things without asking questions, you're gonna pay for it, right?
You're gonna say.
Relatively or literally. And in this case, it might be literally. And so I think there's just like it's it's an issue that I think folks need to really be paying attention to. So it's good that folks are paying attention to it.
I think I'm just kind of amazed at your story and all of these issues and honestly really just thinking about how we got here from my days in high school and where we go next. And I honestly I feel like with young people like you, so passionate, so knowledgeable, and so engaged. Um, I personally feel sorry we've left this problem. It's not going to be a problem, I think, that will be solved, while I'm active. Um, but feeling very confident uh, about, young people with your leadership skills and passion.
Well, young people give me hope, and I say this as the eldest of Gen Z and the youngest baby of millennials. I don't know if either will claim me. So
We both want to claim you.
Both want to claim.
Both want to claim you.
I'm right there
Yeah.
in the middle. But Gen Z is so absolutely inspiring in the way that they show up just in life, in work, in advocacy. They're one of the largest voting blocks and one of the most like informed, I would say, voting blocks. And their use of platforms like TikTok, particularly for education, and using like Twitter for education, like people have more access to knowledge than we ever have before. And I think a lot of that is because there's a lot of creators that are like quite literally just making a platform based on educating folks about issues. And it's really getting people civically engaged. And Gen Z is going to show out in droves during election season. And it gives me a lot of hope that, folks are coming out. Because I think like millennials are a little bit jaded for not being able to buy a house. And Gen Z is like, well, we never thought it was going to happen
Yeah.
anyways. So, so the young folks are like, yeah, things need to change.
But
Yeah.
you
That's
did
funny.
comment in passing that you don't have a lot of faith in institutions. And yet, I mean, this is just a dilemma because, you know, when I was a young organizer, I actually believed in that I believed that America was for democracy. Now, obviously, I was white and middle class or upper middle class, so democracy tended to work better for people like me anyway. Um, but and I think that your feeling about not having faith in institutions is one that's shared by a lot of people in your generation. But yet, on the other hand, we need young people to get engaged and vote and believe that that matters. And I'm just kind of from your own personal experience and thinking about that. How do you balance those two sentiments?
Yeah, I know. This is a conundrum of my everyday life too. I'm just sitting there like, oh my God. And I think that this is true with like a lot of folks that I've talked, like my friends and whatnot. Um, Not having faith in institutions doesn't mean that we should abandon it. We have to change the systems that we have. And, when we think about things like the police that were quite literally instituted to capture slaves and to protect corporations, like that that was the history of policing, and that is like what that has changed into and what we see today, like knowing that that's the roots maybe isn't a system that's made for us. So, in knowing history and knowing how to evaluate what systems we have, we are more better leveraged and able to make them into what we need. So, knowing that, our state governments aren't working on behalf of us, we actually can diagnose the problem and then fix it. So, yes, I'm absolutely mad that we are where we are right now. And I think that that is a really good point to start off of actually doing very deep and intentional democracy reform. It's an evaluation of the systems that exist. Does our Supreme Court make up? Is that what serves us right now? We're asking these questions that we've never like really nationally in such a large scale conversation asked before. And that's what gives me hope, is that people are disillusioned, but they also know what we need to change things and are speaking out about it. And because we have so much access to information and conversation across so many different types of people, we're able to then like really assess the needs that we have and then work to fill those. I think voting is not a question. I don't think anyone is sitting there thinking, oh, should I vote or should I not? There might be some people, but for most people, they're going to go vote. It's the question of what else can we do, and that's what I think what we're parsing out and what we're trying to figure out, and what it looks like of actually reforming our democracy to make it work for us.
Yeah, I love that you use the word leverage in your. It's like such a great way to think about it, right? Because if you know what the system was built for, you have the leverage and understanding to change it. And I think the other thing I always remind people is like these institutions didn't get the way they are because people opted out. They got the way they are because some folks opted in or had the access to opt in, right? And it was done by design. It was done by people voting for a certain. Our Supreme Court is the way it was simply because one voting bloc who likes their guns voted on one issue only, and that was a conservative Supreme Court, right? They opted in to get it that way, and if they can do that, we can reverse it. And my belief is we have way more numbers than them. It's not a persuasion argument. I think all three of us and the folks we work with are on the right side of the numbers. It's just about undoing the very tall mountain that they've built in front of us to get there. But we can. And it's great because I was going to ask you what inspires you and what keeps you what gives you hope, and you both of you guys answered that, so we don't even need to ask the last question. My last question is like plug something. What do you want people to go to? What do you want people to read? Whatever. Plug your organization. Plug yourself. I don't. Where should people go if they're like, man, this was great. I want to learn more.
What should I plug? Like what things? Okay,
Plug
go
everything.
to yeah, all of it. Visit together.plannedparenthood.org for a really cool community site we're trying to build. It's not done yet, but right now what exists are resources for folks who are looking to learn more about abortion rights and access, the capability of recording, a video recording of your own story and publishing on that platform, and some more resources around cybersecurity and how to share your story and how to talk about abortion exist on that page, and I think is a really, really great resource for folks who are looking to just start getting involved.
Awesome. Amazing. This was awesome. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. I
this
think
was
this was like
great.
super helpful, and yeah, this is better than I even imagined it would be. So thank you.